Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the 10 greatest prog bass players of all time, ranked from 10 till 1. The greatest by me. So basically this is a completely subjective list. It's my opinion, right? And so everybody, before they want to put all their comments in there, you know, saying, oh, there's no such thing as the greatest. Yes, we know there's no such thing as the greatest. You haven't come here to hear the objective list. You've come here to hear my list. Now, I have taken influence and innovation and popularity and all those objective things into account as well. But we really do have a subjective list here of bass players. It's quite interesting when you start to look at prog bass players that some of the most sort of definitive bass players of all time are in the prog genre, but actually there's only a few of them. Many of the bass players in progressive rock bands are doing the job of a good bass player, and that's sitting in the background and just supplying what's required, the fundamental bass end of the music. And there's nothing that really sticks out. So there's some incredible prog bands that haven't featured in here. So what I've tried to go for is bass players who have a signature sound, and that signature sound has been very important in the development of the prog bass style as we have it today. Okay, but again, it's very subjective. And at number 10 we have a choice which is very subjective, but this guy is definitely one of my favourite prog bass players of all time, with an incredible individualistic approach to playing the bass, incredible sound, really brilliant ideas, you know, and this guy's really capable of creating the hook of a prog track from the bottom up, which I think is very important for prog bass playing. And it is, of course, my best friend, my partner in crime, the incredible John Jowitt from IQ, Frost. You know, I've played with this guy on a number of albums, and I thought, shall I put him on the list? And I thought, yeah, if I step back and think of British progressive rock bass players for the past 30 years, this guy has to be on the list. I think he's at his best on this album, Rain, which is my band that I have with John. It also features Miron on guitar and vocals, and the great Rob Growcut on keyboards and guitar, whose dad, of course, was another fantastic bass player, Kelly Growcut from ELO. And so that has nothing to do with me picking this, but I thought it was interesting fact worth a mention. But on here, I produced this album, especially early on in the early days. I was really directing it, and I really said to John, look, I really don't want to hem you in on this album. I want you to do exactly what you want to do. And he does some incredible stuff on here. He never overplays, but he never sits in the background either, and this is what prog bass players do. So that's who I have at number 10. Who have I got at number 9? Well, this is very much of a subjective choice. I thought, well, I really love the bass playing on that prog album, and I love a lot of this guy's other bass playing, and I thought I'm going to put him on, but I didn't know as much as I should about him, so I looked him up and realised that this guy's actually played a part in the development of prog bass playing, and that is Richard Sinclair, right, from the band Caravan, from National Health, and from Hatfield in the North. Right, so I love this album. I've put this album up before. I love Hatfield in the North. I haven't explored Caravan so much or National Health, but the bits I've heard I've loved. Richard Sinclair's bass playing is deft but strong, and it's fundamental. He has a very signature sound. I think a lot of the Canterbury bands have a certain thick signature sound on their bass, which really comes from this guy and the guy that's going to be on the next ranking one up from this guy. But Richard Sinclair also was a founder member of the Wildflowers way back in 65, 66. And I think I really wanted on this video to explain the importance of the early Canterbury bands, and especially Soft Machine. And I think their influence was far more instrumentally than it was, say, songwritingly. I don't think Soft Machine are really a prog band in terms of the songwriting. I think they're a prog band in terms of the instrumental adventureness Is that the right way of saying it? The way they push instrumental music out, they're very influenced, I think, by Frank Zappa, but they take a very British take on it, which makes it even more progressive. Of course, the bass player who's at number 8, I'm going to bring these two together, which is Hugh Hopper, and there we have one of the most important progressive rock albums ever, third. And this is really, how many musicians at this time were buying this and listening to what they were doing instrumentally and taking from that. So Hugh Hopper and Richard Sinclair, if I can get both albums up in the same thing with my little face there, I put these at 7 and 8 respectively. I love their bass playing. I think both of these players, the bass playing is Soft Machine, and on this album it's like the huge majestic root of the music, and I think that's so important for prog bass playing. I think that's what we like about prog bass playing, so I thought these guys needed a credit for that. So who have we got at number 6? Well, is this guy a progressive rock bass player? I felt he had to go on the list. I've got Jack Bruce. Okay, if we look at bass playing, the electric bass is the sort of newest of the instruments in the rock music sort of family. The drums going back to the turn of the last century, electric guitar emerging in the 30s and 40s. Bass guitar is really emerging at the same time rock and roll's emerging. The first rock and roll bands have got double bass, and then certain bands started to pick up with electric bass. I think the British rock and roll bands like the Shadows were quite important to actually putting more of an influence on guitar and bass. I think I'd say Jet Harris is the first sort of bass star. Then John Entwistle comes along in Cream, and there's a strong argument with albums like Tommy that the Who, I just said Cream didn't I, that John Entwistle in the Who, that they are a prog band at a certain point. I don't think around about Quadrophenia and Tommy that we could class them as a prog band, or right on the edge of being a prog band. And of course, John Entwistle's bass playing is very important. He's the first sort of, he's first bass player to use active basses, which pushes the bass sound out front. You get that stronger, thicker sound. And I think a lot of the classic bass players we're going to be talking about on this list have got a lot from John Entwistle. But then comes in Jack Bruce, and Jack Bruce is a very adventuresome electric bass player. I think Cream lay the foundation of all progressive rock in every shape or form. His career then carries on, and I would say a lot of the 70s stuff, he's right on the edges of jazz fusion and prog. This album is very jazzy. This is actually like a very important early fusion album to me. And I think Jack Bruce's virtuosity and the way he used the bass, the sound he got out of the bass, is very important. So I've got him here at number 6. Who have I got at number 5? Right, John Wetton. And I could have pulled the King Crimson album out. John Wetton, he sort of takes that thick bass sound, and he really utilises that in an interesting way improvisationally in King Crimson. And I think from there he really creates his own personal style, which I absolutely love. I think no one's going to complain about John Wetton being on this list. I think he's a very iconic prog bass player with an absolutely superb sound. And when we say an individualistic sound, all of these bass players have a very strong, thick bass sound. It's not like fusion players. Fusion players often have a very liquid, light sound, which is much more conducive to playing fast runs and soloing. Prog bass playing is not like that. It's much more heavy metal. It's the rock sound often in progressive rock bands is coming from the bass. And I think John Wetton's pioneering work in King Crimson really changed the shape of not only bass playing but prog. And then he went on to make this absolute masterpiece. And I just love the bass playing on here. I think he's at his peak on this. Right, so who do we have at number... I think this one's number 5. Wetton was number 6. I made a lot of mistakes on this. I should start again, but I'm not going to. Anyone who watches my channel will know that mistakes are all part of the ambience. That's my excuse. I'm not going back, right? Because I might not remember all the things I've said. So who do we have at number 5? Geddy Lee. Now, when I did my guitarists, a lot of people moaned because I didn't put Alex Lifeson on my list of 10 prog guitarists. So why put Geddy Lee on the list? I feel that Alex Lifeson's guitar playing is an amalgamation of guitar players that went before. He's really bringing the hard rock influence in, and he sounds like a hard rock guitarist. But when you actually listen to what he's doing on guitar, I can't hear anything he's really innovated as much as, say, Neil Peart. I got told off for that. You get told off for a lot of things when you get YouTube done. So Neil Peart and Geddy Lee. Geddy Lee's bass sound is really coming out of a Chris Squire. I think it's also coming out of a Jack Bruce. I think it's coming out of John Entwistle. So we put all that together and you get Geddy Lee. But Geddy Lee pushes that bass sound even further out. And on this album, we have the mighty Cygnus X1. And on that, there is a bass riff which if I think I was doing great bass prog moments, that may well be top of the chart for me. So for that alone, and for his bass breaks that he does in YYZ, those little bass solos that every bass player in the world knows, Geddy Lee's on the list. And he's high up. And why is he high up? Because I think there's a difference between rock bass playing, heavy rock bass playing, and progressive metal bass playing. Progressive metal bass playing has a certain level of virtuosity that wasn't heard in rock bass playing, and I think Geddy Lee's the guy to really lay the groundwork for that. I don't think there's, all the progressive rock bass players like John Myung from Dream Theater and all those guys, they just wouldn't be there without Geddy Lee. Also, Geddy Lee is playing keyboards, bass pedals and singing all the time, all at the same time, which is a staple. If you're a prog bass player, that's what you have to do. I can remember John Jowitt joking to me, that if you become a bass player in a prog band, you're also going to ask to play the keyboards with your feet, which is a bizarre thing, And I've seen Rush live, and that was the thing that astonished me more than anything else was Geddy's ability to just do so much at the same time. So he's on there at number 5. Right, this is a really contentious choice at number 4, and I've put this guy pretty high up. But I think in terms of bass sound, innovation, style, way outness and progginess, this guy has to be on the list, and that's Mick Karn. Listen to the silence. At number 4, Mick Karn. Right. Is this a progressive rock album? Yes, this is a progressive rock album. Right, this should be a classic progressive rock album. I've argued this before. Right, and I'll argue it again. When punk comes in, punk is the anathema to prog. It just straightens prog out, and the prog artists draw themselves in. And a lot of those bands that come in, the post-punk bands, are dripping with prog. It's just prog that's been pulled in. And Japan are probably the best example of this. Is this punk rock? Is this new wave? No, this is out and out prog. Right, from the imagery to the what the lyrics are about, to the English aesthetic, to the instrumental virtuosity, all we haven't got is epics. That's all we haven't got, right? Mick Karn is such an important bass player to the sound of prog bass playing over the last 40 years. He's made with, if I think of now, like Polytown with Bozzio, David Torn, out and out prog albums. If you think of David Sylvian's solo albums that he's played on as well, these are out and out prog albums. I think that Japan are a prog band, and we should welcome them in to the genre. Open our arms up and bring in Japan as one of our own, because this is a prog band. And on here we have some of the most incredible bass playing you've ever heard. I think most prog bass players working today have a lot of Mick Karn in their DNA, right? Now this guy probably no one's going to argue with, but I would argue that this is probably less of a progressive rock bass player than Mick Karn is, and that's Percy Jones. But for some reason, I don't know whether it's because they're British or because Phil Collins is in the band, but Brand X has been welcomed in as an honorary prog band. So prog musicians listen to them. here we have what can almost be seen as the British Jacko. Percy Jones emerges at the same time as Jaco Pastorius, playing fretless bass in a virtuoso way, using harmonics to expand, you know, the vocabulary of the bass. He should have gone down in history the same, you know, class as Jacko, in my opinion. But what's interesting is that a lot of progressive rock musicians listen to Brand X, and I would think that most progressive rock people would class Percy Jones as sort of being a progressive rock bass player. So his influence is there, and if you think of a lot of modern prog bass playing, we could see it as having a lot of Mick Karn and a lot of Percy Jones in. So I've put him at number 3. Why is it at number 3? Because he's just such an incredible bass player. All right, on this list, an absolute one-off individualistic genius. Right, so who do we have at number 2? It is, of course, the incredible Tony Levin. All right, I think Tony Levin's work with Peter Gabriel, with King Crimson, more than enough gives him the prog credentials. Of course, he's done all sorts of other things. He actually comes out of the American jazz scene in the late 60s. He gets offered the gig with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and he could have well gone down as being one of the great fusion bass players, which I believe he is. You know, he's a master jazz player, he's a master rock player, but I really class him as a progressive bass player, progressive rock bass player. Why is that? Because of his approach to sound. He can produce that thick bass sound and that liquid sound all at the same time. He's got one of the most signature sounds in history, and his approach to the bass is absolutely unique. I think only a prog bass player would stick drumsticks on their fingers and play the bass like that, and then go on to play the bass like that on hit records, because he's also a pop bass player. So Tony Levin, what a guy! This is one of the greats, and I think there's only one bass player at number 1 that we can put above Tony Levin, and of course he has to be there. You know he's going to be there. It's Chris Squire. We're talking about one of the greatest bass players, period. I think if we look at the history of bass playing, I would be going John Entwistle, Jack Bruce, Chris Squire. I think that's the lineage, right? I think bass players like Stanley Clarke, that we would then mention in the next breath, Stanley Clarke, Jaco Pastorius. You know, if we're going down that line of bass playing, would mention him as being an influence. If we're looking at rock bass players, I think rock bass players, we're listening to Chris Squire, and he was an influence on them. So his influence is absolutely huge. On this list, he is just the obvious choice, without a doubt, to be number 1. He's really defines, he's there right from day one. If you listen to the first Yes album in 1968, he's there from day one. So as much as I would like to credit Hugh Hopper and Richard Sinclair as creating the prog bass sound, so does Chris Squire, and that almost becomes the bass sound for all prog bass players. And so many bass players on this list, I think their sound has come out of Chris Squire's sound, like I said about Geddy Lee. He's has a brilliance which I credited with my friend John Jowitt of having. He's able to create bass lines upon which the songs are built. But one of the things that Chris Squire doesn't do so much is riffs. He can do it. But when I think of Chris Squire, I think of Roundabout, and I think of when Bruford and him kick in with that groove, and you get that thick driving bass sound, which is providing the rockness of Yes. Without that, right, Yes become a sort of ethereal, folky, classical band. It's Chris Squire that makes them rock. So that's my 10 greatest prog bass players of all time. I hope you agree. I'm sure many of you are now going to start having a go at me for not pronouncing stuff right, or not mentioning so and so, where's so and so, you know. And all I can answer is this list especially is really been influenced by my own personal choice and the bands I listen to. Should Roger Waters be on there? maybe, yeah. There's a whole number of bands I nearly put on the list, but I'm not going to go through that because this is my list. You've just heard it now. So stop moaning. If you don't like it, go and watch somebody else. See you on the next video.